There are a huge number of challenges in Africa. I think your point is absolutely correct, that many corporates are seeing the great potential that Africa has, and to some extent Africa is the massive untapped continent in terms of consumers, in terms of raw materials, across a whole number of aspects. I think one of the things that people don't easily recognize are that Africa is not a single place. There are many different cultures, there are many different languages, many different ways of doing things, and your consumers in different parts of Africa are very different people. So a generic answer of how do you go into Africa is not that easy to answer. It needs to be situationally specific. It needs to be specific to the product or service which you're selling, but more appropriately, it needs to be specific to the country and the cultures into which you are taking your product and service.
Now, would you say employing a global agency could be an answer?
I think global agencies do have benefits in terms of bringing best practice. However, a global agency on its own is very unlikely to be able to effectively take you into Africa. And I think at best you need an agency which has continental understanding of the way in which, in general terms, Africans tend to think and behave. And even there I'm generalizing, saying Africans tend to think and behave. And I think the localization per country, and sometimes even cultures within countries, is very important. So I think a global agency can only be successful if it has very close association on the ground with local players that it's working with.
Jeremy, I'd like you to come in. What do you think is the perception of African brands by Africans currently?
I think the first thing I would say is Africa is the most under-branded continent in the world. And you actually try and think of a totally African brand, we would have difficulty. And this is where different countries, different cultures, as Anthony's saying, will have different brands that dominate. But at the moment, probably two of the biggest brands in Africa are both South African. They're probably, I suggest probably, Standard Bank and MTN. And this is where, of course, the cell phones over the last 10 years or so have started to dominate. And those are the major brands. But other than that, you know, people talk about Europe being very tribal. It's not just Africa that's very tribal. You know, if we said we were going to market into Europe, we know that's a bit silly. But likewise, we get lots of people saying they're going to market into Africa, and that's a little bit silly as well. Because it's not just by country. Within each country, there are tribes, you know, as we know in South Africa. And if you don't have that understanding, you'll fall flat on your face.
South Africans are very loyal to their brands. Is this the case in the rest of Africa? I mean, this is a question either of you could really answer.
It can be the rest of the world. You know, it's not just an African thing. I remember arriving in Barcelona a couple of years ago, and most of the brands there were Spanish brands I didn't know of. Whereas you go into most airports and you see all the usual suspects, Coca-Cola, Sony, McDonald's, whatever. And so certain countries can be very patriotic.
Is that the case, though, in Africa?
I think provenance in branding is a really important aspect. And that provenance, sort of, from whence I come, is applicable in any country. And used appropriately, it can be a massively strong force in the consumer. If I pick an example in Africa, in Nigeria, Jeremy's just mentioned MTN. They were one of the first entrants. And the third entrant into the mobile telephony market there was a company called Glo. And Glo chose provenance as their basis. And they said, we will be an international standard network operator, but we're Nigerian. We're proudly Nigerian, and our branding and our advertising is about being Nigerian. And they have been massively successful like that. So I think provenance in any country in the world, people tend to be patriotic of their culture, their country, and if you can leverage that within your brand, you can be really specific and you can be really successful. The issue is, once you've leveraged in one country, how do you then expand? Now you've gone, we're proudly Nigerian, and they want to become West African. Then you've got to change the nature of the brand positioning again to leverage that Nigerianness into West Africanness and maybe into Africanness later down the track. But simple answer to the question, patriotism is a massively powerful brand force.
Go to East Africa, if you can't put on a Kenyan t-shirt, you put on Tusker, which is the main beer, you know, and that is synonymous with that part of the world. Is it strong in the rest of Eastern Africa? Not as strong. It's seen as a Kenyan brand. But this is where, you know, sometimes in South Africa we're seen as trying to be dominating when we shouldn't be. Likewise, in certain parts, whether it's Nigeria, Kenya, they're the prime countries, shall we say, they're not treated with the same respect in adjoining countries. So it's not just a South African thing.
How are local brands faring compared to international brands?
Up into the rest of Africa.
Up into the rest of Africa.
I think there are a lot of local brands that are doing exceptionally well. I mean, Jeremy's mentioned two very strong ones, being MTN and Standard Bank.
There's your Nando's?
I was going to say there are the smaller brands as well, and a little below or a little less in the sort of public face all the time. Nando's, SAB, and it tends to be SAB not through its SAB brand, but through Castle, and SAB have taken a very different strategy. Once again, when they've bought into some African countries, they run the local brand.
Yes.
And in fact, you wouldn't even know that it's SAB. You know, in Nigeria, again, it's Club Lager. And Club is what they're punting, and it's to get back to the provenance, what we were speaking about just now. But then they're brands like ShopRite Checkers. And I would suggest that ShopRite Checkers have just found a really special niche for how to deliver retail appropriately into developing countries. And they do that really well in South Africa, but they've tweaked it to be able to do it well up through many countries in Africa. And there are many South African brands doing well in Africa. In fact, I would suggest to you that South Africa as a brand does exceptionally well in Africa. And there's a bit of a juxtaposition here, but many countries look to South African skills and talent as their way of internationalizing. On the other side of it, they also look to South Africa and say, but are you just the new colonizer of Africa? And I think as South Africans, we need to balance carefully across that, so we're not seen as the new colonists, but are able to offer brands and skills and expertise into Africa, which generally is more appropriate than the skills and expertise that will come from countries which where the people have grown up only first world.
But you're talking products and services as well, largely, and this is where countries now are brands in their own right. You know, South Africa is promoting itself from a tourism point of view, especially in the run-up to 2010. But we forget that other countries in adjoining areas are all rebranding themselves and promoting themselves because they want a slice of the cake. You know, Mozambique rebranded about 6 months ago. Botswana, Namibia, Mauritius, I see, is going to be a destination. So this is where it's changing. I think one of the biggest turnaround stories is Rwanda. The way Rwanda is rebranding itself and promoting itself, and amongst younger people, it's seen as a marvellous place to be.
If I understand, it was voted the top reformer.
You're absolutely
in
right.
Africa.
And this is where they've obviously put a lot of money behind the marketing in the whole world of Rwanda being the place to go.
How would that translate, though, to that country's brands in terms of positioning yourself first and foremost as a nation and then filtering that down to your services and products?
I think any product or service which comes from a country comes along with the perceptions of that country.
True.
If I explain that, I mean, simply if you're buying a motor car and it comes from Germany, you don't need to know anything more than that, and there will be a certain set of values that come along with that. So whether you're delivering a product or a service and it comes from South Africa or Rwanda in the case that we've now, the more positive the perception of Rwanda, the more likely you are to be able to have a positive perception of the product or service as well. The important thing though is countries will brand with certain attributes. So if we think that Rwanda is a great place, but only because it's a wonderful place for tourism, it's unlikely that you will think manufactured product from Rwanda is any better because Rwanda is a great tourism destination. So the thing is to develop a positive image around the country which stretches as far as you need it in order to cover the exports, products, services, or inbound tourism that you are looking to offer from the country.
Shouldn't you explain what stretching a brand is about there? Because otherwise we're going to get a bit technical here. No, but you're stretching from tourism
let's
to
get
business.
technical.
In really simple terms, brand stretch would be a brand offers a promise, and a promise of certain brands is sometimes quite narrow. You say, I trust, and let me use Virgin as a good example in terms of brand stretch. You might say, I trust Virgin in terms of air travel, but now they open up gyms. You say, well, because I trust them in air travel, will I trust them in gyms? You say, well, I like the way they do things, so I'll give them a go in gym. So therefore you have stretch across a category.
Yeah.
There's some brands that you look at and you go, well, I'll use this brand, I'm very happy to use this as a brand of toothpaste, but if they manufacture a motor car, there's absolutely no way I'm going to take the loyalty they have in toothpaste. There's too much stretch. It can't stretch as far as credibility in manufacturing motor cars. So that stretch is how far can you take the positive aspects of that brand and make it apply to different areas that the brand could leverage off.